Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Other Minds and Hands. This is episode number 94. And today, Maggie and I are following up on something we've been talking about doing. And that is bringing in someone to help us understand more about anime and anime conventions. This is something that several of you have been interested in as we've been discussing the War of the Rohirrim and, understanding it as anime. And a lot of people have I've heard lots of people making like vague gestures toward like, of course it's anime, and so it's like, but what does that mean? Like, how does that affect our expectations? So instead of speaking vaguely about this, we have brought in somebody to help us with this. We're joined by Anni Fosberg today. Anni, welcome.
Yay. Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, Anni is Anni is a preceptor in our space program and has taught a number of modules on anime. Some of you may know her from that. But Anni, we'd love to hear more about some of the stuff that you've been doing in our space program.
Thank you. Yeah. So all of the modules that I've precepted so far have been about anime. I started out with a module on Natsume's Book of Friends, which is my favorite series, and I sort of moved from there to a couple other more general things. For instance, I taught a class early last year, I should say, on the anime of everyday life, where I looked at various mundane genres of anime. There was a class on eating our way through anime, about food and anime, which I co-taught with Bronwyn Rivera,
Nice.
who's a brilliant student in the master's program. I did a sort of rerun of the class that actually got me into space, which was the cultural history of anime and manga, which was originally taught by Robert Steed.
Yes.
And who was the person who had initially pushed me to get into precepting in the first place.
Absolutely.
So we taught that together.
Robert Steed, the godfather of East Asian fantasy studies at Signum University. Yeah.
Well, and it's Robert that introduced me to you. So Robert and I were talking about, anime and adaptation and Tolkien and in a different context. And I was like, so we have this project coming up and I really need to talk to somebody that understands it. And he was like, well, I can, but you know who you should really talk to? So thank you, Robert, for introducing us to Anni.
Absolutely.
And we'll bring him along sometime to chat too, because I had a session before we filmed our documentary. I had a session with Robert and Anni where it was like, here's all the things that bothered me. Can I talk through them with you? Right. And they basically talked me off of a ledge of quite a few of them, because it was like, well, no, that's kind of standard in anime. Let us talk you through it. It was so helpful. So yeah, I'm really excited to have this chat with you tonight about War of the Rohirrim, but also anime kind of generally, about some of the different techniques and how that factors into adaptation. And we'll just think it'd be really interesting for people to change their minds like I did.
Yeah. So, I would like to, I'm not in... So, okay. I was about to say I'm not entirely ignorant about anime, but I kind of am. Like that, I'm not ignorant in that the sense that I have watched some, so it's like I've never been exposed. But I am not at all. I certainly haven't watched enough to be able to get any kind of a real sense of like trends and conventions and things. And I suspect that there are many other people in our audience who are in a similar position, to me. So I would love to hear, Anni, just to begin by just talking in general terms. When people are saying like, oh, it's anime, and so therefore like you're expecting, like, what should we be expecting? Like, what are some of the kind of big picture sort of storytelling differences that make Japanese anime different from, American animation customs, basically?
That's such a difficult question.
It's a really big question, I know.
Scratch the surface.
Scratching the surface.
Yeah.
So I would say, and I'm going to start out with a really horribly broad and kind of cryptic-y answer.
Okay.
Which is that Japanese animation takes animation seriously.
Interesting.
Yeah, and what I mean by that is that there is an anime industry that is pretty large. They're putting out a pretty high volume of stuff, And they use animation as a medium to tell a wide variety of stories, which I think is something that in the West we haven't really discovered yet. So I know that there's this general stereotype that I think we're all growing past, that animation is for children's stories. And I think that everyone in this audience is sophisticated enough to realize that that's not necessarily the case.
That it's not
but there's
really
also...
different from like the fairy tales are for children idea that,
Right.
we've all, Tolkien fans have been, taught to disregard. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And there's also this strong association of it with things that are sort of strictly fantastical or things that are dramatic in certain ways. And one of the reasons I was really excited to teach that module on the anime of everyday life was to explore some of these other stories that I think are less well known in the West, where it's like, we're telling this animated story and it's just about a bunch of girls that go camping, right? Or it's about sports and nothing out of the ordinary happens, but it still needs to be animated because animation allows the story to be portrayed in a specific way. It creates a specific world, which is very similar to the world we live in, but it has more specific aesthetic vibes, I guess.
Okay.
You can make things look exactly the way you want. You can control, the way I always say, you can control space and time, right? So you can get any camera angle you want. The weather is whatever you want it to be.
Right.
And this is just some of the advantages of animation. I think is not really answering your question, but I would say the biggest difference between American animation and Japanese animation is just that there's a lot more of it, and there's more support for it. Like there are more voice actors, there are more people thinking about it.
Well, it is really interesting to think about in that regard because. That element. It's funny because that's not something that I would have thought of, but I can see how it would have a fairly profound impact, right? That there is a convention back to Saturday morning cartoons from when I was a kid, right, and everything, where there is an association, right, of particular genres like superhero stories and fantasy stories and science fiction stories. Those are the things that you make cartoons about, right? And as you say, if somebody's going to tell a story on film about a bunch of girls going camping, they'll just film girls camping. They won't. They don't have to make that animated, right? It's not a subject for animation, and that does really, that's a really intriguing answer. I hadn't thought about that.
And it's that sentence, that's not a story for animation. I feel like anime is really good at asking that question, well, why not? And the way they tell that differently, even just as you were talking, it kind of made me think of it's kind of like when Lewis and Tolkien started writing fantasy and all of a sudden it had a little bit more legitimacy, now there's more call for it because there was always an audience for it. We just didn't have the content, but you've got a whole country that's very much there for the content. So I find it really interesting that now we have this Western audience idea with anime as well. We've talked about that a lot with War of the Rohirrim, that this is anime, but very much for a Western audience. Well, what does that mean?
Right.
So I'm asking you because I think that'd be kind of interesting of just what do you think some of the differences might be between an anime audience and a Western anime audience?
I think part of it is the expectation I talked about earlier of the fantastic. And I think also there's, and certainly we see in this film, a greater expectation of things being similar to live action film. So when I watched War of the Rohirrim, the first thing that I noticed was that it seemed to me to be very artistically very conservative. A lot of this, I think, comes from just the fact that it's based on this film that is already a Western film, so it's already in that world.
Right.
But it very much is, let's make everything look realistic. We're going to have very realistic human motion. We use the motion capture. All these people are going to look kind of like people in real life, except for Hera, oddly. Yeah, we're not going to do any sort of really absurd flights of fancy. The colors are fairly realistic. It's a very grounded, and that's not foreign to anime by any means. There's lots of anime that has this more realistic look to it. But I did get the sense that they didn't want to get too experimental with this film because partly because they're trying to appeal to Jackson film fans. But I think partly they are trying to appeal to an audience that's not used to anime. So I have this fantasy, right, where they do an adaptation of the Silmarillion in the style of how they did Heike Monogatari, which is this important Japanese it's a monogatari. I guess you'd call it an epic. And they did it in 12 episodes, and they did this Studio Science Saru, and it looks really interesting and cool, and they have these sort of blobby. It's difficult for me to describe what it looks like. But it looks very anime, and I'm making finger quotes because I do want to acknowledge that there's this wide variety. But I would love to see something more fantastical if they didn't do that.
So I want to go a little deeper in that, because that's one of the things that I have the hardest time really articulating. And I know, like, all generalizations are always awkward, and as you say, there's a huge wide variety, so you can't pigeonhole what anime looks like or what anime does. And yet everybody does talk like that, like how, this didn't look very anime, or like this, and even like when you were just describing the conservatism of War of the Rohirrim, that was also my impression. But I want to make sure I'm understanding that properly. So by conservative, you meant primarily things like, its similarity to what a live action film would look like, right? So whereas in an anime, so when you talk about it being like more anime, you would mean more detached from normal things like huge improbable spiked pink hair kind of thing, or like or motions and actions more detached from the laws of gravity, or what sorts of things would be like more anime?
I'm thinking about having a distinctive visual style. And the visual style it's going for is pretty much the visual style of the films, right? So again, visual style is something that's very hard to describe in a spoken medium, but they could have made things, they could have played with the colors, they could have made the characters look a little bit more, and the word I'm tempted to say impressionistic, right? And I do want to talk, I think, further in this conversation about how they do make the characters, they make the character a little bit impressionistic insofar as a lot of the expression they have comes from things that you wouldn't necessarily be able to get in a live action film or looking at a real person. But there are lots of ways to make a character who you look at this character and you get certain impressions about them, right? Or their physical movements will express their emotions in certain ways. So if you go to someone like, let's say you go to a Miyazaki film, because those are very well known, and we have something like Spirited Away, and there's that scene in Spirited Away when they're giving the bath to the spirit, and there's Chihiro's reaction, right, the main character, and you see her and she is sort of shocked, and there's this sort of reverberation that runs through her out to her hair, and her hair just sort of fizzes up and falls down because she's reacting to this strong smell that she's sensing. So you have these moments where this isn't what things look like, it's what they feel like. And this movie seemed very much based on what things look like.
Yeah, we had a couple moments of that, like anime style that I was asking you about, where when Hera was shocked, her eyeballs like vibrated in her skull, and I don't assume that's what it actually looks like, but that felt like a very anime style. So there was these moments where I felt like that kind of helped the emotion come across because it was differentiated. That's
Yeah,
why
I think
got on that statement.
I think Hera's a really interesting character in that respect, because you do get, like, her eyes are very different from the eyes of the other characters, right? She has these big listening eyes, and you get a lot of expression just from the way that her eyes move. And you do get these sort of extreme facial close-ups from some of the other characters, but I think you get it from Hera much more than the others.
Right. Now, tell me, you were saying that when it comes to like motion and everything, that you felt that Hera was the one who was more anime and the others were all less. Is that what you're saying before?
I think things got a little mixed up when I was saying it.
Okay.
I think that motion overall, like, this is based on motion capture. It's not based on an expressionistic motion mostly.
Okay.
But in terms of just character design, I think Hera, they gave her a much less realistic character design. They gave her a less detailed character design. And that was really interesting to me because it's common in anime, actually, to make the main character look a little bit different from the rest of the characters. Like you'll give them a different hair color, right? So the characters that have bright hair are probably important characters, more important than the ones that have like darker hair, or some other kind of physical characteristic. And that's certainly happening here, but it's happening to a much more extreme degree than I've usually noticed. And I've seen people say that she looks like she belongs in a different film. I think that on a second viewing, that's a less strong impression. But I do think that they gave her a different style for reasons I'm not entirely clear on. It's partly to do with making her stand out, but it was a little bit odd to me.
Yeah. So, interesting what you're saying about less detail. I mean, I think I'm comparing her in my mind to Helm, right? The way that Helm was depicted. And with Helm, we got lots of the very realistic detail of his armor, which looked very much like the armor from the films, of course. And we get a lot of like hair and beard motion and like, muscular definition, in like Helm's beefy arms and stuff like that. Whereas with
wrinkles, he has like wrinkles.
Right, yeah. Whereas Hera is now she's likely to be smoother than her aged father, and that's normal. But yeah, I can see it didn't strike me in that sense of it being less detailed in that way, and certainly their choices of here we go. Looking at Maggie's got some examples here. Their choices of her clothing also tended to be less detailed. I mean, the shot that we have, Maggie's showing a shot of the opening throne room scene, and this I think is I was gonna say her most elaborate costume. Possibly the married to death torn wedding gown at the end is a little more complicated in that it's got shredded bits flapping about. But
this one's her own. That one
yes.
she puts on.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, most elaborate of the ones that belong to her.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, the detail. Like, look at the hands of the two of them, right there. Right. And the face. The face, not only the wrinkles, but the shadowing and the lines. Look at like the definition of his nostrils, right, and the lines. And his nose looks like a nose. Hers is the anime. Hers is just it's not even line. Yeah. And the mouth, his is a mouth. He not only has lips, but he's got like a shadow under his lower lip. Yeah. Whereas she just has a line. I mean, it's interesting. I hadn't thought of it in those terms. But yes, it's not just that he has a beard and wrinkles and so has more going on in his face than she does under any circumstances. But yeah, no, that's really interesting.
And I suspect that she is a little easier to animate. And this is one of the driving factors behind characters having simplified designs. If you're going to have people involved in these elaborate fight sequences, it's a lot easier and cheaper if they don't have too much going on. Although I would argue that Helm is probably involved in, at least as much action as Hera is in the film. Right. But I think part of it is just how she's being portrayed. I think part of it is beauty. I think she's being portrayed as very beautiful and therefore less feature-y. Right. But she really stands out as looking very different from all the other characters. Yeah. And even if you compare her to like Hama, who is a very beautiful character, she still looks more abstracted than he does. Yeah. Hama. So I have a shrewd suspicion that Hama looks like is one of the characters of the film who looks like he would be more at home
Like if Hama were to be transplanted to a different Japanese anime, Hama would be more at home than most of the rest of them would be. Am I correct? I'm judging this primarily upon my teenage son's response to Hama. Because he was like, "Oh, I loved Hama. Hama was great. I loved his whole look, right?" And I was like, "Okay, so that's telling me something." My son is a big anime fan, so he clearly kind of felt at home with Hama in ways that he didn't feel at home, like with Haleth or with Helm, in the same way. And yeah, look, his face is just like Hera's face.
Yeah.
He's got the not really nose. And the barely mouth, right?
These are technical terms, right?
Yeah, that's I hate to pull out such technical vocabulary, but it's interesting. But I agree with what you're saying before. It clearly can't be just a question of efficiency. Helm gets a lot of screen time, so if you're gonna choose to have Helm have, beard with the shadow of beard, and I mean, like, if you're going to that level of detail with Helm, you're not trying to save time, right? By doing this, it's clearly a stylistic choice that has a different grounds to it.
But I could also see, like, in terms of production, like you were saying, Annie, like, Hera is the main character. We need to spend more time on her. We know they were on a shortened production schedule with this, and they had to outsource to a bunch of different animation houses to get this done in time and everything. So I guess if you're going to put the effort in, you're going to go for the larger than life character of Helm, and Hera just needs to function. I mean, I'm trying to put, like, practicalities onto it, so I'm not sure if that would work or not, but I guess that would be my thought of, like, why Helm does have so much detail, because he is this legendary character, and Hera needs to function throughout the entire film more easily. So maybe they just focused more on his animation because they had to pick and choose a bit more.
Though again, if you're just picking and choosing for the sake of, like, well, there's something we want to, like, why not Hera in addition to Helm, or even instead of Helm, right? And I get that, there are reasons to have his face have, but it's not just a question of he has lines on his face which tells you he's old, right? I mean, look at those nostrils, for crying out loud. It's just completely different. He's got nostrils and fingernails and individual eyebrow hairs, for crying out loud, right? I mean, that's not just an added detail. It's a totally different style.
Not to mention his hair is a whole separate character, right? Like,
yes, yes.
Now his hair may be the most anime thing about him, right? Because it's so expressive.
Yes, very expressive.
So expressive.
Yeah, and which is both a thing that I was noting with some interest, though didn't love, in the frozen Helm shot, right? When we see him frozen, but his hair is still billowing, in the frozen wind, and I'm like, but why didn't his hair freeze? Shouldn't his hair be like? He looks like a statue, except for his hair, right? And that was
okay, but that was one of the things I asked Annie about, and it was like, because that's cool.
Because it's cool.
Because it's cool.
Like, that's a rule in anime. It's allowed to happen. It doesn't have to make sense. It can just be cool. I was like, I like that. I don't have to try to figure it out.
Is there something? So, what is sort of conveyed by that? Like, why? What would be the reason why they would want to be like, okay, no, like, the hair must billow. Like, yes, the body is frozen solid, but we insist on the billow. Like, why? It was one of the moments where I'm like, am I just, like, not picking up what they're putting down here? What does that suggest to an anime fan?
Well, hair is one of the things that's really used to distinguish characters. Again, like, characters who are less detailed than Helm often are distinguished by their hair, and it's often used as a characterization device. And it can often add a lot of drama. I love to and I'm coming back to this, but I'm just thinking back to, again, Hama, he has several moments where he has sort of the dramatic hair blowing, and that makes him much more appealing, I think. So hair movement is a really convenient and common, I think, way of expressing that something important is happening, something important has happened, there's some kind of movement, this is an important moment. So and I'm imagining an alternate version of this film, right, where Helm's hair would just sort of lay down and acted like hair and didn't like do anything, and he's still going to look really dramatic because he's Helm. He's giant. He has the hammer. Yeah. But he looks much more just like kind of a guy. If his hair is flying around, first of all, he's much bigger. He has bigger hair. He's a more expressive character.
Yeah.
And like, by the way, the length of his hair increases, I think, the size of his head by like certainly at least twice.
Right.
But also it adds to the drama of the moment. So you can tell this is an important moment because his hair is doing cool stuff. Even if he's standing still, like his hair is going to respond to sort of the laws of drama.
Helm is frozen to death, but his hair lives on. Yes.
His hair lives on.
Yes.
I love that line.
You know, you're looking at something kind of legendary and mythic. It's like the hair has got to be in place.
Okay.
I love that. His hair is going to respond to the drama.
Yes. It's like a drama index, right? The hair? Okay.
Right. The higher the hair, the closer to God.
Right.
This is making me think about contrast. I'm just curious about your thoughts on the animation of Freka, because he was quite different in style to me, and movement was totally different. So just curious if you had any thoughts and observations on him.
Well, I really enjoyed your observation when we were talking earlier about his gait and how he walked with the sort of swaying gait. I saw that really as a way of emphasizing his weight, which is commented on in the text and is commented on in the film. Yep. It's a major part of his character. And we see that he moves like that, like he sort of has to rebalance whenever he moves. What I didn't notice the first time I watched, the second time I watched, I noticed Wolf had picked that up just a little bit. There were a few moments when he seemed to move a little bit more with that rolling gait. And that was really interesting to me. He takes up a lot of space, Freka does. And in some moments, it seems like he takes up maybe even more space than Helm. Like they go out to the fight, and Helm is there. Helm is a giant. But Freka is standing next to some of his entourage, and they look... It's like when you're watching an NFL game, right? And you have, like, the offensive lineman and the running back sitting next to him, and these people look like they were constructed according to different proportions. Like, like one of them was stretched out in Photoshop or something. Like, it's almost that same effect. Yeah. Right? Where he looks like, you can tell he's important because just sort of physically he is taking up the entire screen.
Right. Right, and he's wearing a belt buckle that's about 3 feet across. Yeah.
Yes.
So that's
it's a WWE belt buckle.
The WWE wishes they had belt buckles like that.
But the belt buckle makes sense given the size of his person.
Yeah.
Right?
No, like, he wears the heck out of that belt buckle. I gotta tell you. Yeah. No, I agree. No, it is. Yeah. His swagger was, and that really captures, that's important about that moment, you know, his entire attitude. And he doesn't get that much. I mean, he's dead pretty early in the film. So, you know, his on-screen impact needs to be maximized for that. And that's clearly his entire, his arrogance and his attitude needs to be captured pretty efficiently.
I think it works also in contrast with Wolf in that moment, who's quite demure, right? Like he hasn't quite gotten to any rise out of him yet. So it's I hadn't noticed him mimicking the gaits, and I'll have to watch that again. But that's really interesting to like have him kind of physically take the place of Freka as he continues, and to start in such a opposite pole of that and be able to make that transition. That's pretty cool visually.
Are there moments in the film, Annie, that when you were watching, just like with your own experience of anime, things that you were, where you were thinking like, oh, that was really fun or that was really interesting, but I bet a lot of people won't get that, or like, because I mean, I'm sure you're aware that many Tolkien fans watching this, had very little idea or very little experience with anime. Were there things that you were thinking about that you sort of would like to give people pointers on in that way?
Yeah, there were a couple things. So one of the things, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, is the way that in anime, it's really common to use hands for expression, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you can tell someone's emotion by sort of you zoom in on their hand and it's doing a thing. And I think my very favorite scene with this was the second proposal, right? Where she's captured, she's in Wolf's tower, and they're talking about how they should, like, she should marry him. This is going to stop the war.
Right.
And you get so you get a shot of them. It cuts away and shoots, and you get a shot of the fire.
Mm-hmm.
And then it comes back and you see the shadows of their hands. And their hands are reaching slowly towards each other, and then it pans out slightly and you see their actual hands. And there's this moment, and it sort of lasts for an extra beat. And I think this is something, I don't think this is too hard for people to interpret, but you might not have noticed it, like people might not have noticed as much as I did, where you have like this really clear symbolism of these two hands reaching toward each other, and then sort of Wolf pulls his hand away.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and that's something that, again, if you're familiar with anime and anime conventions, that something would jump out to you more because the focus on hands is a common thing.
I mean, it definitely jumped out to me. I don't know. If you talk to 20 anime fans, I don't know if they'd all say the same thing, but to me, it definitely stood out.
Sure.
But that makes sense that there's just different cues that you'd be looking at. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily study the hands. Of course, you're going to notice the hands. That doesn't mean they're doing something in every scene, but you're going to notice them. So when they do something, it probably is trying to tell you something.
So when you say that, when you're talking about hands in anime, is it normally like close-ups of hands or just like hand gestures that it's close-ups?
Well, I mean, you'll sometimes get hand gestures, but yeah, I'm mostly thinking of close-ups, right,
Okay.
at this moment. So like you'll have, the classic like balled fist, or
Right.
that kind of reaction to things that are happening. Like you'll have emotional reactions that are expressed sometimes sort of via hands.
Yeah, that is really like that's not something you would expect to see in a live action film, right? Of like someone's upset. It's not that like we wouldn't understand the clenched fist, but you normally wouldn't spend a shot on like just the hand, and then come back. But in anime, okay, right now that you mentioned that, I'm like, oh, actually, I think I remember seeing that. Okay, well that's really interesting. Other moments, you said there were a few that you were thinking of.
A couple scenes, right?
Yeah, there were a couple things, and I got really involved in what I was saying, and let's see if I can remember.
Right.
There were a couple moments, and they were really subtle with this. I think because they wanted to have a really consistent style. There were a couple of moments when they were shifting scenes, and they would do something where the style would shift just slightly to help you kind of move into the next scene. And on Maggie's sort of grid of screenshots there, I think I saw at least one of them, which is the scene with the moon, where you switch. And I've seen this done in live action, right? But like they have this shot where it's just like the moon is huge, people are in front of the moon, and it's just the style is slightly different in that scene. Like it doesn't look the same. Or there's another one where they cut to the blizzard. Yeah. So that scene with the moon, like we are coming from a scene where there's much more detail. There's much sort of brighter lighting, and we suddenly move to this. So I like those moments as signals that a different thing is happening in the story now. So you can shift the story by kind of changing the style. Or the shot with the blizzard, right? When they cut to the blizzard, suddenly like it looked much less focused, it looked much less detailed. It was again more impressionistic because we're cutting to this snowy scene, and you're like, scene setting, now there's snow. So
Right.
That makes a lot of sense. It's kind of like blank space in a book. Like there's just a little bit of a breath, or a fade to black in, traditional film. you get to do that with a visual cue of animation, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Easy transition.
Can we talk?
I loved the.
Oh, go ahead. Go
Sorry.
ahead. No.
Just, I don't know if it's a transition thing, but I loved the use of some of the CG animation in this, especially in the landscapes. Is that something you would traditionally see in anime, or do you think, I mean, a lot of things I was reading about this was a cutting corners, how to get something out quickly in terms of animation, and this is faster, but I really thought it was effective. So just curious, like, if it's used often and how you thought about that.
You're seeing more and more CG in anime these days. And it's controversial. People have a lot of different opinions, and I think that you're very right to note that sometimes it's used effectively and other times it's used ineffectively, right? The quality matters a lot. And I think that certainly it can be a cost-cutting measure, but there are also artistic reasons to do it. So, for example, there are whole series now that are made with CG animation for stylistic reasons. A really popular one right now is Beastars, for instance. And in this film, they use CG a lot. They use it in a lot of those scenes where you had to have some kind of elaborate motion. Like I noticed some with the bridge, for instance. There was definitely some CG going on in there. And I think some of the scenes that Maggie just mentioned with the scenery shots. And it is certainly, you can do complicated things with CG that you can't easily do when you're drawing it by hand. And I think the bridge is a great example. Like, you have that complicated machinery that needs to stay consistent and be a specific shape. And it's easier to do that with a computer. The challenge to me is making sure that it fits in with the hand-drawn animation that's around it. So there are a lot of cases where you will see this combination of CG and hand-drawn animation, and sometimes it really stands out and looks bad. Sometimes it blends in and looks good, and sometimes it stands out and looks good. But that is the hardest to pull off, I think.
Yeah, Storyteller on YouTube is just pointing to an example of that, how he felt that especially in the early part of the film, we got 3D backgrounds and 2D characters in front of them, and that often looked kind of jarring. Though he says he felt like it worked better in the latter parts of the film, and it was certainly, I mean, many comments that I've heard, and which matches my own experience as well, is that the animation was a little rougher in the early parts of the film than in the later parts of the film. I couldn't really put my finger on exactly why it felt that way, but that 2D 3D combination, like a 3D CGI modeling of the landscape with a hand-drawn 2D figure in front of it, could certainly create that effect, I would think.
I also got the impression, and you'll have to tell me if I'm wrong because I actually haven't seen the Jackson films for a while, but I also got the impression that the landscape modeling at the beginning of the film was very closely modeled on what you saw in the live action films. Yeah. And later on, those scenes during the battle at night, were not as closely associated with those. Is that right?
Well, certainly in the sense, I mean, like the actual where they're fighting, like where the actual battle is happening at the end of the film, the bridge and everything. Like the wall is there in the film. The drawbridge is not there in the film, right? That's a construction there. And even when they're down on the ground fighting outside the wall in the deep, where the battle never is, right? That's where Amir and Theoden are riding in towards that area, right? And it's totally covered by orcs, right? Anyway, so it was nearby. The stuff in the background is the same, but they weren't tied to the terrain, I think, quite as. I mean, Maggie, does that match your experience there as well?
Yeah, and I was going to say the first part of your comment too, of like, we know that they matched to the film. We talked to Dana Faulkner, who was doing some concept art, and they were very clearly like, it has to match. Later on, I don't think it mattered as much. So something tells me they probably still did that kind of detail-oriented matching where they could, but when the priority shifts to the storytelling, and the visuals are different, it didn't seem to be as vital. I think some of the lines, if the ramp is there, if the wall is there, they're going to make sure those things match because we're all going to recognize it. The trolls are going to be looking for something that is wrong, so they'll try to sort that part out, but it wasn't as vital for it to be set exactly in that space.
So then they would have had more freedom to make it
Yeah.
fit in better with some of the other elements that they'd added.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
Which makes a lot of sense. I was also thinking while you're talking about just where and how they used it. So I feel like I'm going to have to do another pass of seeing exactly where it was. Because the ones I remember are all landscapes. So I wonder if those landscapes are either transition, like you were saying, like this is a change of animation style, so we get to take a deep breath, like the warm light after Helm dies and it's all that bright pinks and, really beautiful. That's a transition. Snowstorm, that's a transition. Her climbing up the ice wall to get to the eagles, not a transition. Like that's not a
Yeah.
but it is a transition, or I don't know, it's not so much a transition filmically, but it is
Right.
kind of a transition
Narratively,
actually.
yes. She's
Yeah.
she's transition. I mean, that's like more than a transition. That's a boundary crossing. Like I'm
Yeah.
crossing
Yeah.
from the human world into the eagle
transgression
world.
almost?
Yeah, exactly. It's,
Yeah. No, I think you're totally right on with. Actually, I was listening to the last episode, and I was really excited that you were talking about how she was interacting with the eagles in that moment, because when I watched the film, and I don't want to assume too much influence from Japanese culture here, and also maybe Robert will come tell me I'm wrong, but but the way that she approached the eagles felt very much like the kind of thing you would do in like Shinto, where you're approaching the gods, or the kami, and asking for a favor, because you mentioned how she crosses into their space, but when she does that, she crosses a threshold,
Yep.
which is key to Shinto. There's the mouth of the cave, and she does it at sunset, which is also this sort of transitional time. So I think you're totally right on with that.
Lots of liminal spaces there. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I've also just realized that we haven't publicly posted the roundtable conversation we had with Kirsten Cairns.
Oh,
that
yes.
We referenced you guys a lot in that conversation, so I'll make sure I get that up on the Rings and Realms page soon. But we had this lovely roundtable conversation with them, and we were mostly like not just airing the things that bothered us, but we were airing the things that bothered us. And it was really nice to be able to talk about, why we thought Hera should have died and how ridiculous that bridal scene was. And then to have your kind of analysis as to why that actually made some sense and why that part was really interesting. So, because it's a bit of a elephant in the room for us, I was just hoping you could talk us through a little bit of why that scene worked and what you liked about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think thematically the visuals thematically are very important, right? So she puts on the dress. She has this conversation with the crone and with Olwen about why she's going to do this. It's pretty clear this is sort of an epic troll in a way. Wolf wants a bride, and this entire film has been about him getting basically his revenge on her for not being in love with him.
Right.
So she's going to go to him like that. That's trolling. It obviously represents her commitment to death, which I think you've discussed before. But also just from a visual perspective, the image that it creates is kind of amazing. And I think looking at these images is really important in terms of a Tolkien adaptation specifically, because Tolkien was so into these, like, here is an image. I don't like the story matters, it's there, but look at this image for a second. So you have her in this dress. It's the white dress. She's very pale compared to everything around her. In fact, she kind of glows.
Yes. In that
she's
dress
there
especially. Yeah.
And you notice the scene is at night. Everyone else is dressed in dark colors. They look dark. She is like a beacon of light on the bridge, and even after she crosses the bridge. So so she's, and I like this image that you're showing here too, because you can see that even her sword becomes part of this this glow.
It picks up the light from her dress.
Yeah. So you have this I guess just this really striking everything about the scene is purely about her. She's confronting Wolf, but the scene is not really about Wolf at all. The scene is about how she is taking control of the scene. She's sorry, I got so excited about this, I kind of forgot how to talk.
Happens all the
It
time.
happens to us a lot. Don't worry. You can just keep talking around it. We'll get back to it eventually.
Yeah.
But I think also the drama of her showing up in the dress, of her doing this in the most extra way possible,
Right.
is a huge part of what makes this scene awesome. So you'll see often in Tolkien, like, something happens, again, it just happens in the most dramatic way. You know, you can have Huron tied to a chair and Morgoth, like, making reports to him, but no, instead of that, you're going to give him magic eyesight so he can see the entire world, right? Does he need that? No, it's amazing. That's why he's gonna do it. And in this scene, it's not quite as extreme as that, but I think you have something similar. You have her as this very visually striking character. You have the voice acting where her voice is a major element in the scene. She has this high voice. She's talking a lot and kind of dominating, like the sound isn't as strong around her. And she is able to take this moment and become kind of the figure that Éowyn at the beginning of the film hinted that she would be. So it's sort of this culmination of look at me.
Right. Right. No, that's really interesting. Yeah, I wanted to. Maggie, did you have other questions about the dress in this scene? I don't want to. I don't want to just change.
Probably. There's so many things I want to keep talking about with all of this, but I'm like just taking it in too. But I'm still staring at the visuals of this too, and the sword. I hadn't really studied this image before, but the sword against the dress, I'm really loving as well. I mean, the tattered dark patches of the dress, the dark central triangle pointing down, kind of drawing her heart down into this darkness. The core of the sword is dark as well. So there's this real matching of like dark and light and drawing the eye to these points. And I just love the strength of that I hadn't appreciated before, because I was so annoyed that she was wearing this dress because it didn't make sense to me in terms of a narrative.
Yeah.
But if I can take a step back, it's like, also, I love that she has a real proper sword. You know, this is not like a little girl dagger, because the women always get these little daggers in these stories. So it's so nice to see her with a proper strong sword standing up to him in the shape of the swoop, creating yet another triangle opening up onto him. Like, there's so much happening that I want to like put tracing paper over this and draw all the lines, because it just... now it's saying a lot, which is really cool now that I am not pissed at it. So thank you for that.
I think her fighting style fits really well with what you're saying as well, because they don't have her doing a lot of like little feints and jabs and things. She does this really direct, just like hold the sword out in front of her. There are just straight lines between her and her enemies, and she just like will quickly deflect. And it's very similar to how Helm fights, actually. So in that scene at the bridge, people will come up to him and they'll just be pushed off to the side, basically, by how hard he hits them, and he pushes his fists out directly in a straight line, and she's doing a very similar thing.
Right.
Yep. Very cool.
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit more about Helm fighting. In particularly, I want to talk about the troll, because that was the moment... that felt to me, to my very...
when Corey's head exploded.
My very amateurish impressions, that felt to me like one of the most anime-ish moments in the film, in that like we got... not only did we get Helm like leaping 50 feet into the air and then like coming down, like, which was, you know, I was like, okay, all right, you know, this is now relationship with gravity that, like, you know, I at times associate with anime action sequences, right? But also it was, again, it wasn't even the camera angles and things, like the the one where he's descending through the air and we get the shot of him, which makes him look like he's still, and the background is wooshing around him, right? That struck me as a very anime touch in that moment. And I would be interested to hear about your thoughts of how they seem to because I compare that, for instance, to the battle sequence, the one with the Muma kill, right? Take, for instance, Haleth killing the Mumok in front of Meduseld, right? That didn't feel anime-ish at all. That felt like, Legolas in the film, right? So that whole sequence, that whole battle sequence, felt like it had the live action films very much in mind and was trying to recreate the experience that was like the live action film. Whereas the Helm Troll fight was nothing like that. It went in a completely the opposite direction and was very anime. Though, again, I wasn't sure that I noticed it, like I noticed the difference, but I wasn't sure that I was totally understood. So you've talked before about one of the things that anime often does is it conveys impressions rather than trying to depict things realistically, right? It conveys impressions by what it by what it describes. Is that what you felt was going on in that fight scene? And if so, what are the things that it was like saying to you, when you were watching that?
I mean, I think that's a moment where the film really wanted to get kind of fantastical, right? There's a suggestion that Helm himself is maybe a kind of troll.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. I'm like, let me get those images up.
Yeah. And I think that you do. That's such a great image.
I mean, I thought when I was looking at the thumbnails, I thought this was Helm. And then I opened it. It was like, oh, no, that's the troll.
It's the troll. Right, yeah.
But, look at them next to each other. Like, yeah.
Yeah. And I think a one-on-one fight lends itself to that a little bit more. You can emphasize the specific interaction between these individuals, so it's less procedural, right? It's less like, here's how you take the spear and put it into the Mumok.
Yes.
Instead, it's like these two people are talking to each other, or fighting with each other, or sometimes in certain like battle anime, it'll often be the same thing, right? And a fight is a type of conversation.
Right.
So these characters are isolated, and it's really interesting that you noticed how the scenery was sort of going by, but it wasn't portrayed in detail because they are kind of isolated from what's around them. And Hera is there, but she's not part of that fight either. Really,
yes.
It's about these two characters sort of going one-on-one, looking each other in the eye, and whatever's going on behind them is really not important right now. And I think from that perspective, there's a couple ways you can go, right? So sometimes you'll see fights in anime that are sort of the big guy versus little guy fight, right? So in something like Vinland Saga or Full Metal Alchemist, you'll have these small characters who are really, really dexterous, and they will like defy gravity by sort of jumping. They'll like jump up and stab someone or something like that.
Right.
You'll have this scene where like you'll have the big character will be stationary and the small character will sort of dart around him. In this case, you have two characters who are really big. And Helm has a sort of gravity to him that doesn't lend to like a lot of sort of going up. But what you get instead is you have him coming down, right? So you can't give him that sort of dynamic fight movement the other direction, but what you can do is have him jump down from the mountain.
Right.
And I think that I don't know. I can't articulate exactly what it does. I need to think about this more, I think. But it definitely makes him it makes him an active participant in this fight.
Right.
And you can see that he is bringing the fight through the troll.
Right. I was just going to say that. He's very much the one attacking the troll. Yeah. And it's... So, I mean... Maggie knows part of the reason why I'm really interested to talk about this is that I not only found this very striking in the sense that it seemed to me stylistically very different, almost unique in the film, in how action was depicted. But at the same time, it was also at this moment, I found this one of the most striking moments in our documentary. I spent a long time, Tice, one of my like big deep dive scenes was talking about the madness of Helm and this fight with the troll, and how it had for me an almost allegorical effect. The troll is like, it's like Helm fighting himself. It's like, you know, Helm, king and father, versus monstrous Helm, you know, mad monstrous Helm, right? And so I'm particularly interested in the fact that at that moment when the action feels to me almost not literal, like it's an almost allegorical moment, suspended in the middle of the film, that's the moment when we get all of this impressionistic action, and we get kind of divorced from live action reality more completely than I can think of anywhere else in the film.
Yeah.
'Cause this couldn't have happened in live action like that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, goodness, Maggie, just like the image in my mind that conjured, like imagining a live action version of this would be crazy.
Well,
Like,
it would, if it happened live action, it wouldn't be allegorical.
No.
It would be a fight with a troll, and it would be some sort of drama shot, and we would have the impactful mithril vest. You know, we had that fight.
right.
This is a core inner character traumatic coming to terms fight. Like, you can't do that in live action like that.
Right. Yeah, no, yeah.
But it's also one of those scenes that I feel like translates really well. You know, I'm thinking about the Western audience thing. I feel like I can hear, I can't wait to talk to Artie. We're talking to the writer in a couple days, and I feel like I can hear that conversation of like, this is what we want to show. How can we do it? Well, in this one section, you're able to, right? Like, it doesn't have to be something that's completely scripted, because we're going to visually bring this fight from his heart into the scene. And I don't know if you could pull that off in a different way. But it's a nice opportunity in the story to be able to do it with this bit, because I can't think of anywhere else in the story that it happens quite like this, that there is some other fight going on. I can't think of any other example.
I can't either.
Yeah, I actually noticed it was pretty prominent to me how much this movie is based on sort of being on the ground. And you have the camera, which flies all over the place, which I think is kind of a Jackson thing. I think he likes the swooping shots. But the characters don't move upward. Almost all their movement is horizontal. They stay on the ground, except when they're like climbing, like Hera climbs.
Or jumping out of towers.
Jumping out of a window.
Yeah.
She jumps out of towers and jumps out of a window, which is kind of funny given this director. But but like, for the most part, like they are earthbound. So this is kind of the moment when that's violated.
Yeah.
Well, now I need to know, why is that kind of funny considering this director?
Well, I was thinking, okay, so the director, and there were a couple of things I wanted to say about the director, and I might get to the one I really wanted to say. But so the director is known for a couple other things, and in the promotional materials for the movie, you often saw him billed as sort of the director of Ghost in the Shell. I think that his other work that's much more relevant to this is Morabito. It's much less well known. The main character, if this helps anyone, is actually very similar to Olwen. But let's go back to Ghost in the Shell for a moment. And the images that are, I think, really famous and strongly associated with Ghost in the Shell have to do with this image, which was in the first OP. I think it was the first OP, where she sort of falls off a roof. This main character of Ghost in the Shell sort of throws herself backwards off a roof, and she's like constantly jumping off of things. She's a cyborg. Hera doesn't do that, but you do get a moment where she kind of jumps out a window. She's not as dramatic. She's not as good at it. She doesn't do a swan dive or anything like that, but she does jump out a window. You've got to have one.
Okay, so it's like a signature thing. Like
Yeah.
he loves having his protagonist jump out windows and off of roofs.
I don't know if that's a signature thing, but it's definitely like very notable in the work that's most famous of his.
Right.
That's great.
Right.
Nice little stamp. Are there other elements from the story that you're just like, oh, I really want to talk about this with them, or here's a thing that I really loved how they portrayed? I just want to make sure we don't miss any of your like major bullet points.
Um, I have. Which one do I choose? I do think that there was a lot of influence from Western animation.
Mm-hmm.
I found that the eagles reminded me very strongly of the Rescuers Down Under.
Oh, I just watched that yesterday.
Did you notice the eagle?
I can't say I put that together, but I can see that now. We're like, yeah, they're very similar structural design. Yeah. Go
And I
figure.
mean, that is just what eagles look like, I guess. But like, it's the way. I don't know. If you're
Actual
doing a giant,
animation
like it
style.
reminds me. It reminds me.
Well,
So,
I mean, yeah, I mean, there are certain ways that eagles look, but there can be much difference in level of detail and what you like. For just looking at the eagle image that's behind Maggie's head right now. I mean, look at the level of detail on the feathers on the underside of the wing, right? You get what, like 3 or 4 layers of distinctly different feathers. That's, I mean, again, talk about it. I mean, it's like Helm's nose, right? I mean, like that's a lot of detail that you're using there when you don't absolutely have to. You could just make the wing shape, do the the long feathers at the edges to make it look like a wing, and then don't give all the other feathered. You don't have to draw every single feather, but there's not just individual feathers. There are details on those feathers. You can see like the central line, and I mean it's crazy. Yeah. So that kind of thing. That's a choice. I mean, like they're making stylistic choices in how they depict it. So it's certainly not just a question of eagle physiology.
Yes, and I think you see that in the Rescuers Down Under as well. And the other influence for Western animation that, again, this is something I think Maggie pointed out to me earlier, the green fire, that reminded me again of very much of things that you will see in Western animation. If something is really ominous, and like Sleeping Beauty, you've got the green fire. Right. So that's a Western animation influence.
Well, and later on I was thinking about it, and the green is the mist that envelops the army of the dead in Tolkien, in Jackson's adaptation as well. Yeah. So it kind of just makes sense that there's that kind of tie throughout. But I was pointing out to Annie because the only time green is used in War of the Rohirrim, not with the bad guys, was when there was some sort of like reference to supernatural going on. So like Helm had like a green sheen to him when we weren't sure if he was a wraith or not. And there were just like these moments of like, well, what is that? And it's just kind of touching the void of not evil, but like other.
Spooky.
Yeah.
Yeah, spooky. That's again, technical terms. I need to ask your thoughts on this.
Yeah, that was a flight of fancy. That is something you would not have seen in a live action film. And one of the things that they did there too is I think they really they took advantage of your ability to fudge things a little bit. Like if you watch the elephant in that scene, if you watch the Boomak, it's not the same size at the end at the scene as it is at the beginning.
Right. Yeah.
As it sort of gets enveloped. But this guy looks like he was completely created within the context of this film. And I don't know. There are some things I love about him. Like I love how he's part of the landscape. He's got those trees growing on him. But also it feels like he's part of the lake. He does this sort of spinny move where he comes out of it and then he goes back in. And it sort of mirrors the ripples in the water, which I guess it has to physically, but also like you have this very strong impression that he's sort of part of the lake.
Until looking at this still, I had completely missed the fact that he has 6 ears. Like I would have been surprised with even 2, frankly. But that's
why have 2 when you can have 6?
that's crazy. It looks like it's designed to catch the wind and let him take off there but anyway, that's very strange.
Yeah, he's got the 6 ears and he's got the weird mouth that doesn't look like the mouth of any animal that I'm familiar with. Yeah. Really. Maybe some kind of like a sea urchin or something might have a mouth like that. but he certainly, and I sort of going back to some of the stuff that Corey, that you've talked about in exploring Lord of the Rings, how the Watcher is not necessarily an octopus.
Right.
This guy's not an octopus, right? They were not constrained by this preconception of him being an octopus.
Yeah.
They invented their own, and he certainly doesn't look like he would. He doesn't look like he evolved for anything in particular. Like you said, the ears don't seem to do a lot.
No, no, he doesn't even seem to have full use of 2 ears, much less 6. Yeah, yeah.
But it works. I guess it's a threat display, really, right? He's very good at sort of, this is my lake, and get out of here. At the same time, I guess that's not really his behavior, because he actually grabs the Mumak and eats it instead of scaring it away. But I can certainly see that this is a creature that you would have to take seriously.
And it was just the comparison too, you know, with the Mumak, it fit in. It felt like part of the landscape. We saw something in Jackson like that. This was such a departure. Like, our whole color palette changed too. We got these like rich earth tones and the lush greenery, which we don't have lush anywhere else. So, you know, having that actual, it felt like we were stepping into this little fantasy thing, going into the dark, creepy woods that are kind of unknown and magical, and look at this thing that comes out of the lake. It felt like a portal fantasy within a fantasy, that we're sneaking into this creature.
Yeah, the woods felt like a completely separate place that just lives alongside of whatever's going on in Rohan.
Yeah,
and like the conversation I had with you about like narrative and plot and how anime doesn't have to make, you know, the same kind of sense, that like that whole scene absolutely could have just been removed from the film, so long as she got kidnapped. But that could have happened, you know, on the plains or something. But that whole scene could have been removed and this still would have made sense. But they didn't. They did it. They made this thing and they created this character, and they're like, we're gonna lean into this anime monster. Seemed
to me, by the way, it could have happened much more easily on the plains.
Yes.
In fact, like, you know, when the Dunlending general pops out of the shrubbery right after the Mumak gets killed, I'm like, what? How did he get there? And what was he just wandering through the Forbidden Woods near the lair of the Watcher in the Water when the elephant came along, or like how did that?
And she just took down
woods at midnight.
And she just took down these 2 monsters, and then like it's a sack over the head that gets you? Seriously?
Right. Yeah. No, that juxtaposition felt really strange to me. It almost felt
but
like. Yeah. No, go ahead.
Oh, it's interesting to me, though, because I think most of this movie is based on this sort of very human-oriented political plot, and the relationship between Helm and Freka and Wolf and Hera and all of these human characters. You do have that business with the troll, but the troll is really there as something that's seen by humans, sort of the outsider. This is the only moment where you're like, no, this is a magic world. Something magic is actually happening here.
Right, because you never know when you go into a random forest that part of the forest will come alive and eat the diseased elephant. Right, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Which was predictable. Like, she was using that as a trap. Like, she went in there with the plan to induce the Watcher in the Water to eat the elephant. Like, it's not like that was just some sort of coincidence. Yeah. So what we're running out of time, but I would love to hear you talk a little bit more what Maggie was just saying about the kind of sense that it makes, that the story makes or needs to make. Are there ways like that? Because this is something that I don't feel like I understand very well. The kind of sort of logic of the narrative that would be presumed or expected on the part of a sort of a mainstream Western audience compared to, because that certainly, in my limited exposure to anime, part of my experience has been like, well, I am not even understanding why this is happening. Like, what just happened? I don't even really know. What does that have to do with the rest of the story? Like, this all seems very strange to me. So I have had to some extent the experience that there clearly is a difference. Could you talk about the sort of the difference in logic and narrative transition and things like that in anime?
it's very difficult to talk about that in such broad terms. Can you give me an example?
Well, we were talking with, like, the one that kind of blew my mind was we were talking with one of the producers, and he talked about the 4-act structure and how it does not have to follow the 3-act structure that we know in Western literature. So, like, a bunch of the things that kind of I butted up against was because that's not how my trajectory was working. Like, at this point in the story, this should be happening. At this point in the story, this should be happening. And that didn't happen. And then you also had characters like the crone that didn't do anything. She didn't progress the story. But that didn't matter. They didn't, like, that wasn't the purpose of her. So, like, it was just so interesting to me to have, like, these things that didn't serve a purpose be the purpose. Like, what? So, yeah, I mean, I guess just, like, a little bit more conversation about the narrative structure, like how things are allowed to happen, how things are allowed to have gaps, how things can't be explained. Like, so that's normal, huh?
I mean, I do wish that they had done more with the crone. She was a very strange character, and I really wanted to know what her deal was.
Yes.
I feel like they had more with the crone, right? Like, it feels like they cut a couple scenes or something.
So, like, to me, I was fine with the crone after the one shot, and Annie, you mentioned it, right before Hera goes out to fight, right? The 3-generation female embrace, right, with Hera and Olwen and the crone together. That, like, tableau of, like, the the maiden, the mother, and the crone in one spot being like, and that moment of, like, here is female solidarity, right? Here is, like, the different roles and struggles of women in this culture all gathered into one moment, like the sort of the symbolic force of that one shot. To me, I was like, okay, I'm cool with the crone being it, if just for that reason. Like, it gave me that moment. That moment felt really kind of thematically and symbolically impactful. So I was like, okay, yes, I was finding the crone a strange character who, and like from whom I kept expecting more, in the way of, like, justification. Like, why is this person in the story? This person doesn't have a role in this story, really. But anyway, for me, that moment, I was like, okay, I got that moment of symbolism. I'm satisfied. But it didn't satisfy me for the plot or anything. But
yeah.
So
there are different plot structures. I hope that that's a conversation that will continue, especially if you can. I really want to see that interview that you mentioned, because I'm not ready to map this onto a different type of plot. But I guess what I can say is that you often do get a sense, and this is something I really like about anime, is that stuff is going on kind of beyond the plot. There's this weird forest there. Does that forest have anything to do with us? Well, not necessarily, but it makes the world bigger.
Right.
You know.
Right.
And this is one of the things that I think is really a Tolkien thing.
I was going to say, that's a very Tolkien. Yeah. We're talking about Tom Bombadil, but we're not talking about Tom Bombadil, right?
Yeah. And there is often a sense that there's more going on. So you'll have these little characters that will kind of pop up and be there. Maybe you don't get the full backstory of that guy. Maybe you wish you had it. But sort of he's there, and it makes things often feel more lived in. I'm gonna look out for more examples and see if I can get back to you on that. But I agree that you will often have these little moments that aren't necessarily strict plot progression, more like everything's not about you.
Yeah, that sort of utilitarian assumption that a standard Western movie viewer goes into, like, if a character is introduced, I mean, it's one thing to talk about something like, the Chekhov's gun, right? Like, something appears and it's gotta have a fun. But, like, it's one thing to say something like that, right? And we've even made comments like that about this film. But to assume that, like, every character, it has to have a function. This is what leads people, to say, like, yeah, the Tom Bombadil sequence shouldn't be there. It has no function. It's like, well, no, it does have a function, but not the one that you're wanting, right? I mean,
Right.
if you're wanting it to be instrumental in the overall arc of the plot, then no, it doesn't have a function. But there are other functions. Other functions exist apart from furthering the plot. And of course, when I think about that, I often think about the differences between the logic of fairy tales and the logic of normal stories, of like a realistic Western film or something like that. And there are different conventions, and there are things that will just which don't necessarily relate directly to the story. Anyway, so it's doing, but I agree with you. Tolkien is on the anime side of that, if anything, in that both Tolkien and anime are differing from traditional Western understandings in that way. There is a kind of, I think, sometimes a rather harsh utilitarianism in the way that people understand. It's hard. Sometimes I want to, when people say like there was no point in that person, or in that scene or whatever, I'm like, well, it was very beautiful. Like, that's a point, that's, even if, again, it doesn't have to do with the main story.
And it's nice to be reminded it's not necessarily for you. Like, with Rings of Power, we talked about this a lot. Like, who was this show for? And it ended up that it was for Corey.
For
but,
me, personally, yeah.
But there are moments where you're like, oh, that just didn't make any. Like, the character of Leaf really bothered me because I didn't really feel like he did anything.
I love him. He's my favorite. Favorite. I love him.
So many people I've talked to that have had that reaction, and most of them are anime fans. So, like, it made me check myself and be like, he doesn't have to make sense to you. He can just exist and be cool.
Well, but look, I mean, I think he's really important, again, in a Tolkienian sense, because you need this character who's sort of humble and learns to be part of the world. I love him as a kind of successor to Hama, because he's the one who's going to tell the story, and the entire movie is framed around sort of this story. I love how, like, a lot of this movie is about loyalty and what loyalty means. His loyalty is kind of uncomplicated, and he really cares about it, and he's trying to live up to it. I think that's really important. And he asks the right questions, right? He lets Hera tell her story about the Shield Maidens. He's there when you need sort of the transmission of information to happen. And he's very lovable. I don't know. I love him.
I shouldn't say I hated him. I just didn't get him. So it's so nice when it clicks in. And I, at the premiere, Philippa Boyens stood up on the stage and she specifically pointed out Leaf and said people are going to love him. And I'm sitting there going, why? So I'm really glad to have that perspective. And that was one thing I really enjoyed, personally about this film, is that there was such a fresh space to kind of engage with it, where it's like, I'm ready to learn, show me all the things. This is so fun. And it's so nice to have these conversations with people like yourself that have this different expertise, to just not get mad, to not, you didn't know that, you didn't see that, that's not what this was. It was just so cool to encounter something new and have my mind changed, and a little bit of reality check. You don't have all the answers. It's kind of nice when you get a little bit of a different vibe. So thank you for that.
I think in a perfect world, and thank you for being willing to ask the questions and not just try to judge everything according to the standards of Western film. I think in a perfect world, a film like this would be an invitation to people who maybe haven't experienced anime before to explore a little further.
I mean, I love those bridges between books and films. It only makes sense that there's bridges between different styles and ways to tell the story as well. That's what's so fun with adaptation. There's so many different ways that we can tell these stories in different spaces. Why not do it between Western and anime film expectations? So cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Awesome. Well, we're getting towards the end of time here, so we should probably, this is the time at which I start feeling guilty for keeping Maggie up so late. But
and I'm going to sleep bit longer, but
Yeah, awesome.
it is
Well,
11 o'clock where I am.
it is. It is. Annie, thank you. This has been a
Thank you so
really
much.
fun conversation. Tell like you've got some stuff coming up in space.
Yeah, so Aiden Anistad and I are offering a module in April in space that we want to co-precept. We're calling it Media as Medicine, and it's about the genre of Iyashikei, which shows up in anime and manga, and it's the healing genre. The idea is that it's very chill, it's very mellow, not a lot happens, although sometimes more happens than you think, and it makes you feel better.
Yeah.
So speaking of stepping outside of those Western film assumptions, you can just have a show about girls camping,
Love it.
and it's good for you.
Right.
Oh,
Awesome.
I love it.
Awesome. Yeah.
And Corey and I will be here for the next couple of weeks at least, so I don't think we have a gap. We'll be here next week, same
I
time.
believe so. I believe so. Yep, absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you, Annie, for joining us.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Look forward to. Okay. Hang on. One last thing I did want to end with. Gregory had asked a question earlier on that I wanted to come back to real briefly, which is just, are there other stories in the Legendarium that you feel would be really good in anime? Like, having seen this one, was there any? I know you talked a little bit about your sort of big Silmarillion idea, right? But are there thinking of this kind of stuff? Are there stories that just jump out at you like, oh man, this would be so good in anime?
Oh wow, my brain is short-circuiting. There are so many
There's got to be
of them.
so many.
Yeah.
There's so many. I mean, I'm gonna go with the 2-or story.
The discovery of
Yeah.
Gondolin. Yeah.
The discovery of Gondolin.
Yeah.
I think he's such a good character. I think that I'm just imagining the story that you could have about sort of him wandering around, who he is when he's wandering around, how he changes when he goes
Yeah.
into the city. I think that there's a lot of scope there, but I think that almost any of them honestly would be great. And I'm gonna say secretly, hot take, I guess, I think that anime is probably the ideal medium for adapting Tolkien.
Interesting. Yeah. I'm gonna go ahead and say that in the 2-or anime, I think that Idril would have the most expressive hair. Like,
Oh, yes.
she doesn't get that many lines, but her hair is like all over it. Right. Yeah.
Yes, she's going to have completely flowing hair,
Oh, yeah.
and she's going to have some kind of garment that like matches, like flows, like moves similarly to her hair, and she's going to symbolize sort of movement within constraints.
That's it. Yeah, I would expect her not to say that much, but her hair would provide a running commentary on everything her father does for the whole time. Yeah, cool, awesome. Well, thank you, Annie, so much. I wanted to remember to ask that before we left. Thanks everybody for joining us. We'll see you again next week. Annie, thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, this is great.
Bye everybody.
Night.
Night.